Let me just quickly turn to Mohammed bin Salman, the 29-year-old, in Yemen. So this is a young prince who's in power. He's been now under his father's rule a little over 100 days. In these 100 days, he spent $50 billion of the $750 billion in Saudi reserves. The $50 billion was mostly spent on basically payouts to all the public civil servants of the kingdom. In one decision, he spent $32.5 billion and 2 months of extra salary for every public civil servant in the country, which is basically 90% of the working population, the Saudi working population. And he's clearly someone who is on the make. He is someone who wants desperately to build or pad his CV, as we say. And there's nothing like padding one's CV than a quick military victory. So it seems that he is the person who has convinced the king that a quick and swift war in Yemen that would defeat the Houthis, who by early this year, had not only taken over Sana'a, but seemed in their alliance with Ali Abdullah Saleh's forces, who, as I remind you, are trained by the United States and armed by the United States, were advancing on the rest of Yemen, engaging in battles with Al-Qaeda, but also taking over the state and the control of the country. So Mohammed bin Salman used this opportunity, I think, to say, look, we have to bolster the existing president of Yemen. There's this very complicated set of political issues where the president of Yemen was sidelined by the Houthis. We have to save him, and in order to do so, we need to wage a military campaign. The military campaign that the Saudis have waged in Yemen is an interesting one because it's not in keeping with their tradition of foreign policy making. The Saudis have never actually sort of gone on the offensive in this way. They often prefer to pay and buy and co-opt rather than engage in violence domestically or regionally. So it's a real break with the tradition of Saudi foreign policy making, and I think it very much has to do with this young prince and the way he sees things. Now, officially, it's the war in Yemen for the Saudis is to bring back the president who is now in exile in Saudi Arabia, to bring back President Hadi to power, to restore kind of the legitimate government of Yemen. But it's also intended to send a signal to the Iranians that they should not meddle in Yemen. It's not clear, as I said to you, to what extent the Iranians are meddling, in fact, in Yemen, because the Houthis are an indigenous group that has a history of violence and warfare against the Yemeni state that predates anything Iran has done or Hezbollah, its proxy, has done. And the war is being prosecuted in the way that Israel or the United States likes to prosecute wars, which is basically through air power rather than through ground forces. And Yemen is not a country that you can win a war through air power. So we've had an air campaign now in Yemen for over a month. It has created very considerable humanitarian crisis in the country. And the Saudis don't seem to be able to reverse the tide of war because the Houthis, with their allies, are still advancing on most of the fronts, including attacking cities and towns on the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So the quick victory, the padding of the CV, sort of way of thinking about things and the policy that Mohammed bin Salman has pursued has not worked. And very recently, a ceasefire, I think a 4 or 5 day ceasefire was announced by the Saudis, but now that has lapsed and the Saudis have resumed their air campaign. And the Yemenis are basically taunting the Saudis by saying, if you're men, send your troops here and let's see whether you can fight. The Saudis, knowing that they won't do well if they were to send ground forces, have been desperately trying to get the Egyptians, the Pakistanis, and most recently the Senegalese to send troops to fight in Yemen. None of these countries, although some have sent troops, I think the Senegalese sent 2,000 men, none of these countries are willing to go into Yemen because they know that it would be a military catastrophe and a quagmire.